Good morning, good afternoon. My name is James Lattimer. I'm one of the comisarios invitados of Documenta Madrid this year. And I'm very, very happy to be here with Curtis Winter and Anders Edström, one of the two directors of the works and the days of Toyoko Shiojiri in the Shiotani Basin, which we're incredibly happy to be showing as a special screening at the festival. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the film. So welcome both of you. Thank you very much for taking part in this online discussion. So I wanted to start by talking about the village that makes up the film's central setting. And what I like so much about the village is that it's maybe not, conventionally speaking, at least beautiful or remarkable, perhaps. But I was also thinking that because of that, in itself, it must have been relatively difficult to choose that particular location, because obviously there are many, many such villages in Japan, and in a sense that also is perhaps, I would imagine, one of the reasons. So I was wanting to start by asking about how did you come across that particular village? What was the process of making contact with its inhabitants? And at what point was it clear that the film would take place there?
Anders, maybe you can start with that.
Yeah, well, that's my wife's grandparents' place where they lived their whole lives, and so I went there the first time in 1992. And started taking pictures, and so I've returned to this place many, many times over the years, and so I kept photographing the place for 23 years before we started filming.
And what was the point then? I mean, if it was a kind of a literally familiar place, what was the point when, you know, going there to visit family became, okay, we would like to make a film here? And also for you, Curtis, what was it? Because I mean, obviously, for the two of you to have such different connections to it, because I imagine, Curtis, for you, it was obviously an encounter with a place that was much less familiar.
Yeah, I mean, I had heard of, we first visited this village in 2003. And so we'd had some time to think about it. Anders has been photographing this village since 1992, and I mean, I end up seeing most of the pictures Anders takes, and have done for, 20 years now. And so I had a familiarity with the place through his photographs, which he's documented, very thoroughly, which we'll see evidenced in a book called Shiotani that he'll be publishing in March. That'll be over 700 pages of photographs from these 23 years.
Oh, that's amazing.
And so I had that, and I had talking to Anders, and I had talking to Yoshiko, and talking to Anders' children, Nils and Mai, who appear in the film, about this place. But then in 2010, Anders suggested maybe we take a trip there to see if I wasn't able to find an angle in on how we might construct a film. And so we went there and just spent time, as we had done previously, just kind of waiting. Anders with his still camera, and I brought a field recorder. And it was finally one night over a dinner, very similar to how we arrived at the concept of The Anchorage, our previous film, which is, it was around the dinner table after having eaten, people having drinks, and stories emerge. And Taeko, the film's central figure, told a story that she'd never told before about how she had been coming to terms at this point in her life with a lifetime of regret over opportunities that were denied her due to her sex, a university education that was denied her in favor of her younger brother getting university education, a career that was denied her, to make way for the concerns of her husband, and starting to come to terms with all of these what ifs. And she had never told this story before, and I think the men in the sitting around the kotatsu with us were maybe made a bit uncomfortable by you know, the clear kind of emotional resonance of what was being said. And we knew that in that moment, we had enough to get to the starting point of making a movie. And so that was how we arrived there. On another note, though, you mentioned the village and that perhaps it's imperfectly beautiful by conventional standards.
Exactly.
And that's another point that's really important for us. I think that, yeah, we tend to work in a way that has a disinterest to consensus beauty. And if we were to shoot in a place that was so classically beautiful, that where the architecture was all traditional and everything was sort of, too overly pleasing, I think in those kind of environments, we find ourselves a bit paralyzed, because if one can only create an image that every man, woman, and child would agree is beautiful going in, then what is it that the artist is asserting? And the chances are is that it's very little. For example, I live in a town, Oxford, England, which is one of the most charming towns in the world. And the result is that I basically can't even pick up a camera because there's almost no way to take a picture here, at least for our concerns. And so the idea that this was a village that had a bit of traditional architecture, but also had a bunch of kind of concrete and fiberglass tilt-ups, sort of gave us this kind of a little bit of friction that gives us something to work with.
No, that makes perfect sense, because I think that the beauty in the film is a kind of a beauty that's much more hard won, or it's a beauty that's kind of really extracted from an ongoing engagement with the place, and not just, okay, we have a pretty house that we can frame in a nice way and then we're done. I mean, I think and that's something particularly that I think across the duration of the film, and this kind of, I mean, the film anyway works with this idea of kind of moving around the house and the village it's in, and then the landscape in which both are in, and kind of extracting different angles, different perspectives, different visual impressions of that place over time. And in a sense, it's also an accumulative beauty, I guess, on that level.
Well, that would be the aspiration, at least.
I think you met the aspiration, which is nice. But can you, the two of you, maybe talk a little bit more about, I mean, obviously, you know, from the idea in 2010 to the sort of the actually making the film. I mean, how much, I mean, I guess, particularly if it's like, you know, a family place, it's maybe difficult to kind of make a precise delineation between when you were making the film and when you weren't. But what was, maybe you can talk about the actual production period of the film, how much of that time was spent shooting, how much of that time was spent preparing, and can you also talk a little bit about the collaboration with both, you know, Anders, your family, but also with the other members of the village? I mean, I imagine a relationship was already well in place before you started working, but still, on some level, also working with people that you know can be more complicated than working with people that you don't.
Well, it's, I mean, because I was there photographing them for such a long time, they got used to me being there with the camera, and that's not only the family, but that's the whole village, because I was always this foreigner who walked around with the camera, and over the years people started to get to know me, and they learned that that when I take pictures, because I'm always taking pictures of something, I take pictures every day, and I'm always looking for a new way to photograph something, or often the same things, but so they learned that when I take pictures, I mean, they should just ignore me. And so I think already when we started filming, I mean, by that point they were, of course, filming is a different thing. It was a little bit another something bigger and more people, but at least they were used to just keep on doing their own thing.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I think some of it is, yeah, I mean, they had had a chance, many of them, because Anders is, his work is frequently published, and so they had not only had a chance to have their pictures taken, and they not only had a chance to have him present at some of the most important moments of their lives, weddings and births and funerals and so on and so forth, but they'd also had a chance to see this work published in magazines and journals and so on. And so, while on the one hand, you might think that this is this highly kind of unmediated village, they have a kind of maybe an unexpected familiarity with seeing themselves represented that had taken place, over 2.5 decades. And so it was a slow accretion of kind of trust and familiarity that kind of went both ways. Yeah, and I think that's so built into what we do. It wouldn't be possible to have made the film without that kind of lead time. In two different ways. I mean, so that there was a sense of us having, I don't know, accreted some sort of right to begin filming. But number two, to also work through a lot of the touristic observations that one might make when one first arrives in a place. I mean, I think any place one arrives, at the beginning, one will take pictures of things that are too readily interesting.
Sure.
Or essentially too interesting to be interesting. And it's a matter of then boiling things down to images that maybe have a longer half-life.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one aspect. But another aspect, I think, was discovering a sense of the villagers, that this is a village that likely won't survive more than a couple more generations. The young people have all moved away to the big city, and it's a village that's in the process of shutting down. And so in terms of the relationship of the villagers to the film, I think they were quite pleased to see the film as something of an heirloom, something that they could leave to future generations as an example of this way of life and this collective economy, and this is how your grandparents, great-grandparents, etc. You used to live. And so I think they were all quite pleased to take part in what would be this kind of immortalizing of this sort of time and place.
That makes perfect sense. And in terms of the kind of the concrete amount of time, like the actual shoot, how long was that? Was it continuous? Were you there for just one big chunk of time, or did you go back and forth?
Yeah.
And also, was that time delineated from the outset? Was it clear, okay, we're going to shoot for, 13 months, or was it more a kind of going there, shooting, seeing, returning, a kind of a process-based thing more?
We knew from the outset that we wanted to go there multiple times so that we could see the changes in the landscape and the changes in the soundscape, and allow for life to happen between the rounds of filming, so as to kind of, replenish the coffers for us then to come in and carry on with filming. But it was 27 weeks of filming in 4 different rounds.
Okay.
Over a period of 14 months. I think the only change from the beginning conception in terms of just that basic timing was that we filmed with 5 seasons instead of 4, realizing that if we had made the mistake of making a 4 seasons film, that people wouldn't stop carrying on about that, and making sort of excruciating allusions and so on. And so we went into a 5th season just to dispense with that.
That makes sense. And the 4 blocks, do the 4 blocks that you shot correspond in a sense? Because I watched the film online, but the 4 parts of the film, do they correspond to the blocks? So was there kind of like maybe shooting at one point and then putting it into a different part? Because with some shots that's not possible, with other shots maybe it would be.
Yeah. For the most part, the second round is the second round. For the most part, the third round is the third round.
Okay.
But the first and the fourth are significantly jumbled.
Okay.
And even with the other rounds, there's a bit of jumbling to all of them, because I think a lot of the night shots and interiors, it isn't important when they were filmed.
No, of course. I mean, it's a thing.
Sometimes yes, but oftentimes there were things that were usable. So it's not perfectly. There's a lot of expressivity. It's not just a realist chronology. It's very much an expressive enterprise.
Sure. No, I mean, I anyway wanted to talk a little bit about the relationship between observation and staging in the film, because I think there's a sort of a very interesting continuum there, which the film kind of operates on and kind of moves around on, because, you know, there are certain shots and sections, mainly of the actual setting and of the landscape, which obviously are kind of pure observation, if one could even say that as a word. And then there are sequences with the characters which sometimes feel more observed, sometimes feel more staged, also based on often how they're filmed, because there are some sequences. I remember there's a scene where Toyoko walks through the house, and it's very clear that she's walking through different spaces and the camera is in different places at each point. And then obviously there are certain moments which are self-evidently fictional. I mean, when the two figures who are presumably Toyoko's parents disappear on the path at the end of the first part, or when the soldier in uniform walks down the road in the fourth part. I mean, obviously there's no way that one can see them as anything other than stage. And I'd be interested to know the kind of that back and forth, or the kind of how that sort of relationship was navigated.
Yeah, I mean, we go to a lot of trouble to make things seem, I don't know, a certain way. And well, I don't know, maybe I'll start over. I think with the anchorage, there was a certain amount of confusion sometimes of people thinking that aspects that were clearly fictional were indeed documentary, and people would talk about the film as if it was some kind of hybrid or something, which doesn't really interest us very much as a way of thinking about what we're doing. And so I think there were a lot of these kind of very overt interventions of clear artificiality, so as to constantly be disabusing the audience of this idea that what we're seeing is real. So this scene you mentioned where she goes through the house and opens and closes every door, or also the appearance of, you know, two actors who, I mean, will be quite familiar in Japan, but I think even to art house audiences, people might recognize Caserio from the films of Hong Sang-soo and Kirasami and so on. They are there to constantly remind you that no, this isn't a documentary. This is totally constructed, and that in every scene other than the funeral, there is always at least one person who's operating on a fictional direction. So that while there might be documentary components found in many of the shots, every shot has some degree of phoniness to it. I mean, they're all fake. They're all fake, and there's always at least one actor in every scene.
Interesting.
And so that's kind of, and so that's why these kind of overtly artificial moments appear, is to constantly be reminding people that this isn't that, so then what is it? And then hopefully, you know, I mean, we won't answer all those questions, but hopefully those are questions that are part of the fun for the audience, that then how was this constructed, and what does this construction say about construction in the first place?
No, for sure, because I think there is this constant kind of feeling across the whole film, is like, what is this? And there are certain, particularly with the kind of the strong focus on a kind of an observation of a space empty of people, of a landscape. Obviously, those observational moments can easily seduce you into the thinking, okay, we're seeing something documented, but then there are so many kind of moments that pull you in and out, or that kind of lull you into a security and then take you back out of that security. And I think, I think for me, it was this kind of constant interrogation of the film, but also interrogation of myself in terms of what am I projecting into the film based on, you know, the kind of the viewing habits that I have, or the viewing habits that are established in conventional cinema. I mean, I think another interesting part of that is also your own presence in the film, because both of you also appear. It's interesting. I was looking in the closing titles because you appear as yourselves. I was also wondering, because I think, you know, obviously from a documentary perspective, this idea of, you know, inscribing yourself into a film that you're making, that has a kind of a long tradition. In fiction, maybe much less so. But I was thinking a lot about, you know, the decision to incorporate yourselves. I mean, knowing also about Anders' family, you know, maybe obviously begins to explain it on some level anyway. But then on some other level, the particular way in which you do it, I thought was really interesting, because it's not, you know, it's you know, both your presences and then also the presences of your children. And it's, you know, they come in, you come in, come out. There's never any explanation as to what particular time you might be there. There's no justification. Okay, these people are here for this reason. And so yeah, maybe can you talk about the idea of doing it and also the precise execution of that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the central points of the fictional construction of the film is the de-emphasis of exposition.
Sure.
A kind of undoing of the expository, so that relationships aren't made explicit, and the presence of individuals is left unclear. And I think this creates, again, more, I mean, I think when you make a film like this, it self-selects for a certain audience, and I think it's a kind of audience who wants to be free to think. And I think by, de-emphasizing the expository, you give, you know, a capable, competent audience, you know, more freedom to let their own imagination come to bear on the work, which I think is much more interesting to us. As far as our appearing in the film, it was something we talked about beforehand, because, you know, Yoshiko had brought so many people by this village. I mean, I know that some viewers are going to want to think that this is this, you know, kind of hermetic little, you know, kind of mountain village. But Yoshiko and Anders had been bringing friends from London and New York and Los Angeles and so on through this village for 20 years. So the idea that we were there is perfectly normal to this place. And so, yeah, we felt that our being in the film was just an extension of that normality and wasn't particularly special. But even still, we debated whether we would get in the film, but it turned out just through contingent forces that the first scene we filmed was the funeral of Juneji, and it simply just would have been too disrespectful for us to be at the funeral and keep ourselves planted behind the cameras. We had no choice but to step into the funeral and take part. So once that choice was sort of made for us, we sat down and figured, okay, now how then do we incorporate ourselves into the film, you know, going forward, so that it, you know, becomes a grounded part of the film's language. And, you know, at that point, then we just sort of used ourselves in the film essentially as sort of mischief makers or whatnot.
Yeah, I think that's a good question.
Yeah, going in and directing in front of the camera and revving things up from within. I mean, you know, it's very important to us to be very disciplined as much as we, you know, are capable listeners and lookers, and so we were hesitant, you know, about the idea to break that listening and looking by putting ourselves in front of the camera. But because the first break was sort of made for us, we thought that, yeah, the film could benefit from an occasional rupture in that looking and listening. And so that's sort of how those came about. Yeah.
That makes sense.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think also, yeah, when we were filming the funeral dinner, which is a completely fictional staging where we redid the night of the funeral and got everyone back in their black suits and so on and so forth. this was the first week of the filming of the film. And as Anders was saying, you know, they were all so familiar with him filming and taking pictures. And we were used to these dinners sort of being these lively affairs and, you know, with plenty to drink and eat and jokes and so on and so forth. But we did find that switching from still camera to suddenly 2 movie cameras, it got everyone a bit tight.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And suddenly that joviality that we had expected wasn't there, and the lines weren't being delivered freely, and the scenes weren't coming together, and we had filmed 2 dinners that were just unusable. But on this third night, the funeral night, as we were going to have to go to so much trouble to restage this, we had to get it right. And so we, you know, I've mentioned elsewhere that, you know, the image of Jerry Lewis in The Day the Clown Cried came to mind, this image of him in his clown makeup behind the camera. And this realization that, yeah, what we need a clown, and it's probably going to have to be, you know, it's going to have to be us. So we conspired with Tayoko's brother Hiroharu to make sure that evening's dinner was especially drunken, you know, beginning the evening with everybody starting with a shot and you know, multiple rounds of toasts. And once everybody got a bit tipsy, the evening started to get silly and people started to get free and people forgot about the cameras and we were able to, you know, get the scene that we wanted and get the lines delivered the way that we wanted them. And once that was broken, there were no more problems with affect for the rest of the filming. From that point forward, everybody was comfortable, and we didn't have that problem again. So
yeah, it's amazing what alcohol can achieve.
Yeah, it can be useful. I mean, you try to bring out concepts or theories to the making of a film, but sometimes really what you need is just a bit of stupidity.
No, for sure. That's nice. I mean, you mentioned it just now a little bit in terms of, you were saying, you know, you were restaging the funeral, and I was anyway wanting to talk about Toyoko herself, because you know, I was thinking about kind of with respect to her, and also with respect to maybe writing more generally, because again, in the closing titles, the diary entries that she reads in voiceover, they're credited to her, and presumably thus also describe her real life experience. So I was wondering, first of all, about the relationship, because I mean, you talked about a restaging. Perhaps you can talk a little bit more about that precisely. And the other thing is with, I mean, the fact that you have one real testimony that's scattered across the film. There are lots of other anecdotes and testimonies also scattered across the film. Obviously, one is maybe invited to also project an authenticity onto them that may not be there at all, or maybe they're partially. I'd be interested to know about sort of that relationship. And also just on a very fundamental level, the writing process itself, how did that proceed? Did that happen in advance? Did that happen during the shoot? Was it a writing process that involved, okay, writing of dialogue, or also writing of scenes, or also writing of individual shots? How precise, in a sense, was the writing process too?
With our first film, The Anchorage, we made what was essentially, a very almost perverse kind of project of homogeneity. I mean, it was a single mode of storytelling with a single mode of filming and a single, you know, it was very much something like that. And so with this film, having done that one and felt that we'd been able to do that, it seemed that a next move would be to create a film that was much more overtly about heterogeneity. So a heterogeneity of storytelling, a heterogeneity of shooting approaches, such that what we see in the film are arrays of different storytelling approaches inside a film itself that has at best a very weak overarching story, if it has one at all. And so we do get the real testimonies of Tayoko's diary. Over the years, we had collected so many stories of people in the village that we then had them retell. so that the villagers themselves could bring to bear their perspectives and their experience inside of fiction. There are the stories of the Jisei poets that lead off every chapter.
Yeah.
There's a story on the television of a rakugo performer who tells his kind of version of a story. There is a scene in a minivan where all goes silent and we simply read subtitles of a story being told, so that then we're forced into storytelling by reading, and so on. And I mean, as you watch the film, you'll see many different approaches. And so I think part of the concern there was, yeah, let's have a heterogeneity of story inside what is essentially a non-story. I know there are other parts to the question, but now I can't remember.
That's okay. No, I just then I mean, I think that explains very nicely, I think, the kind of the tension between, you know, there's also some of the other anecdotes are kind of extracted also from the lived experience of those people. But I would be interested in a sense on a very banal level, like, you know, did you have a script and what did the script look like? I mean,
yeah. I mean, I think that the dominant kind of production mode in not just in Hollywood, but even in almost all art house film,
sure,
is a kind of maxi-poc system. This idea of maximizing the possibility of an okay result, which is you know, trying to make as much knowable as possible in advance, creating as many known knowns.
Exactly. In
order to avoid, you know, at least in terms of the film itself, kind of existential catastrophe. So you have a script that's entirely written in advance. You have rehearsals with the actors in advance. You have tech recs and location scouting and all these kinds of things. So that oftentimes, you know, by the time you get to the actual filming, essentially all that's happening, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, is just the act of illustration of ideas that already have been cemented. And so what we're interested in, you know, which is a model that, you know, it's designed to protect films against contingent forces, which is understandable because films are expensive and so on. But our idea is that those kind of risks don't necessarily have to be built in. If you have a small agile team and you're working with cheap tools, you end up being more anti-fragile. So that you, instead of, if contingent forces happen, deaths or snake bites or so on and so, storms or so on and so forth, instead of a production being put into precarity, the production is actually strengthened because you can bring those contingent events on board. You can turn a fiction on a dime and incorporate them as part of the story. So the way that it's written is to defer as many fiction decisions to the last possible minute. So things are written the day of or the night before.
Okay.
And it's sort of constructed as we go along. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't monologues that are written and dialogues that are written, and it doesn't mean that there aren't rehearsals before scenes. There are, but it's deferred until the last possible minute to be able to execute what we need to execute. And so it's this kind of anti-maxi-poc.
So there's this kind of like, I mean, this is a wonderful thing, that this kind of built-in flexibility, this built-in ability to kind of react to things as they're happening around you, because particularly in that space, I mean, and particularly over that duration, it's obviously not a thing that you can sit down in advance and say, okay, it's going to be like this, it's going to be like this, and on this day it's going to be this weather, and on this day the field is going to be this color. I mean, there is always this kind of, this built-in flexibility, I guess.
Yeah.
It becomes much more like when you take photographs, you don't know what exactly you want to photograph. You go out and take pictures of, or you try to take pictures, and you don't know exactly what will happen, but it depends so much on the light as well, and what you see, and every time it's a different scene, and the way I mean, for me as a photographer, and to actually, it's my main part. My main role is to film, and Curtis makes everything so that I can film like I take photographs as much as possible. So, and also a lot of the time we, I mean, when Curtis sits and writes, I mean, then I go out and film, and then sometimes Curtis goes off and takes sound somewhere else. And if sound is not needed in exactly my pictures, then, and so we just keep on collecting as much as images and sound as possible around the actual scenes, things that we can use to build as kind of cement around the things that are needed for the story.
Sure.
Yeah, that's really important part of the writing, is this idea that yeah, I mean, Anders is my favorite photographer, so part of what I'm trying to do when I'm constructing my part is to construct things such that he has as much latitude as possible, so that he's free to land on results that will be as similar to his still photography as possible. So that when we're, you know, constructing these systems, these contingent kind of situations, they shouldn't be confused with chance or improvisation, because that's not what we're doing. We're creating a system, and in any system there's going to be the deliberate and the emergent. There are going to be things that arise on their own, but if you've created a system well enough, hopefully the emergent moments will be affirmations of the deliberate. And I think that that's kind of much more the way that we work, as opposed to just doing chance or improvisation. It's a system creation and letting things take place within a system. And part of that is giving Anders as much latitude as possible to work like a photographer.
Which also helps from being in this place for 22 years before making the film, because then you know what things that might happen as well. You can foresee things a little bit. Which is even more important when you film, because when you're just taking pictures, at least, then you can be much quicker. But when you film, you really need to see a little bit beforehand that this might happen.
No, and that's also a tremendous luxury, in a sense, to have that kind of reservoir of experience over such time that allows one to kind of also have a different degree of maneuverability than one would have if one were in a space that one didn't know at all. I mean, I totally get that. I wanted to talk a little bit, actually, or go into a little bit more detail about the camera work, because, I mean, first of all, it seems, I mean, and also, I mean, based on what you were talking about already, about this kind of mixing of the different parts and all the different shooting blocks that have kind of been mixed a little bit in terms of the final edit, because the film seems very, very conscious in terms of what it chooses to show and when it chooses to show it, because there are certain perspectives on the house and the village that are employed again and again, and others feel very much like they're being kind of withheld. So the film also feels like a kind of a constant process of trying to understand the exact topography. It's like you're given certain clues, and then you're given maybe more clues, and then, I mean, even in the final part, you're suddenly like, oh, where is this? And then suddenly, okay, that's that from this angle, because that angle has never been shown to you. And also the camera work itself, there's a big kind of evolution, also I thought, in an interesting way, towards a kind of perhaps a more conventional narrative form, because I think, you know, maybe the majority of the film consists of these kind of individual fragments. There's no real repetition of of an individual framing. And then I think it's in the second part that a specific framing is repeated once. I think it's the doctor's, in the scene with the doctor. And then in the third part, when they're bathing, it's repeated 3 times. And then I think it's also several hours in before there's a cut to different perspectives of the same uninterrupted scene. I think the scene where the 2 men are sitting on the doorstep, and you have a shot of them from the front and then at the back, and they continue because that, and in a sense, all of those moments in terms of what the camera is doing or where the camera is placed or the camera returning to framings also kind of, yeah, are constantly making you analyze, okay, so this is a thing that's constantly emotional. You can never kind of relax into the camera mode that's being presented to you, even if I would say the fragmentation is perhaps the dominant one.
Yeah. There's not for about filming or taking pictures, there's no system. It's just, well, I'm reacting to things. I mean, I try to find a way to look at something that I like, but then I also, exactly as you say, I try to, and this is for photographs or film, I try to cover it from many different angles so that you can have this material to play with and to show, exactly as you say, that the clues little by little, and that's something that we learned a lot from shooting the Anchorage too, because at that time we were saying, okay, let's do a lot of these insert shots, like of whatever, that are just like photographs, but we did a lot, but we didn't have enough at all. So this time we really felt that we just need as many as possible in different seasons, in different light, in the morning, in the evening, in the rain, in the sun. And this is also something that a way of photographing things that I've developed over the years, because it's when I make books of photographs, I photograph a place. I mean, I also have a book with from I mean, all the pictures that I took prior to shooting will become a book, and so that's also like photographs of these places repeated, but never the same shots. It's so you see it from a different perspective each time and in a different light, and so little by little it kind of sinks in.
Yeah, just as a point of clarity, you know, because we're like an old married couple, we have a lot of vocabulary that we use for ourselves. So we, for example, when we talk about insert shots, we don't mean it in the way that it's normally used in film, as like a close-up of a watch or a hand turning a doorknob. We mean it as kind of inserts into the narrative. So you could think of them as geography shots or landscape shots or so on and so forth. But yeah, I think also Anders touched on something that I hadn't quite thought of it this way before, but I enjoy this. He says that there's no system for him as he's shooting. And I think that maybe puts into relief some of the kind of division of labor that we have, where we kind of, a kind of mutual trust that we have to let each person do their kind of thing. And so, you know, I will create a system in my mind as a way of giving form to what it is we're doing, precisely so that Anders has an open space into which he can work totally non-systemically. And so there can be at once a system for me, well, he just says there's not a system for him, and it's completely.
I mean, it's amazing to reach that point, actually.
And completely non-contradictory. Yeah, to be able to say that. But also, I think one thing that kind of I enjoy about Anders' pictures, and so we started incorporating it into the film, is that, I mean, I think we have a soft spot for a lot of the lessons of kind of 20th century modernism. I mean, we see, minimal composers in the film, and we see ideas about, materiality and construction and rules and self-reflexivity and so on. But I think but this is now and it's not then. And I think that while we're interested in works by people like Sol LeWitt or Morgan Fisher, where you have a work that is built from a set of rules and the title tells you the rule, which then reinforces the work, which then reinforces the title, and so on and so forth. Something that interests us now, and it's at this moment in time, is to constantly be messing up the rules, to have rules that we work by, and then constantly be messing them up, to do things that break the rules or make the rules fail or so on, so that hopefully it makes it more interesting for the audience to figure out or fail to figure out what the rules were. I think it makes a different kind of puzzle that we hope can be part of the enjoyment.
No, for sure. No, I mean, I can only, obviously talk about my own very subjective experience of the film, but I think it is this kind of, one seat. I mean, obviously there are certain things, certain rules, certain ideas, certain motifs, but never to an extent that one can entirely orient oneself. It is always this kind of trying to kind of position oneself within the film to try and kind of, and I think, I mean, that is what I guess makes the film so very engaging, that kind of, that sense of never being able to relax into, it's doing this, okay, so I can just sit back and then I know exactly what's happening. But there is always this, you will always be unexpected. You will always receive a surprise, or you will always be kind of disoriented or disturbed. Not I don't mean disturbed in a kind of an emotional way, but in a kind of, you can never get comfortable. And I think that is, I mean, for me as a viewer, something, a position that I very much like to be put in, ultimately.
Good.
I wanted to talk, I mean, we talked about the camera work. I also wanted to talk about the sound, because the sound, I mean, again, the sound plays an incredibly important part in the film, I think, because you also grasp so much of that place via the sounds there. I mean, I guess for me, when I think about the film, I almost think about, okay, the cars passing the house, because there is this constant kind of, you feel how that place is based on that, the continual interruption of, or not interruption, but the background noise of the cars passing. But I mean, there's also these sections, these black screen sections where you, in a sense, it felt for me like a kind of a compilation of the sounds that are about to appear in the part to come, which in a sense also has the function of heightening your attention for them when they then do appear. There's also the section in the second part where sound and image are decoupled, like when the two men are talking in the car, and you have presumably what is the sound of the birds from the previous shot. I mean, it's a very sort of, it's a use of sound that very much draws attention to itself as, okay, sound is here, sound should be adhered to, and also sound is being manipulated, sound is being operated with. It's a very sort of non-naturalistic approach to sound, even though at some other points the sound does create this very kind of immersive, okay, I am there right now in a real space that I feel like I can grasp in such terms.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, I mean, there's a lot of ways to go in on that, but I mean, you mentioned the cars passing and I mean, that is the leitmotif of the sound aspect of the film, which is why the poster is just this dot of light, which is a headlight of a car passing through this, variegated kind of plastic window on the garage, because that sound is the leitmotif of the movie. As far as you mentioned the decoupling of the sound in certain parts, and I think that's a way in on just talking about the whole conception of the sound, which again, since we mentioned Morgan Fisher, I think goes back to picture and sound rushes and this kind of fundamental set of lessons that is brought forth with that film. And for people who will be unfamiliar with it, it's a film that explains to us that there are essentially, 4 options in a film. There's picture with sync sound, there's picture with no sound, there's picture with sound, picture with no sound, sound with no picture, and then the null set, which is a silent black screen. And those are the 4 options. And so, from there you get to work, except for some reason, not only in the dominant culture of Hollywood film, but also in most art house films, these 4 options aren't really used. It's only the first option that's explored. The idea of sound and picture. And so it seemed to us such a basic move to, move into the second and third quadrants. Because I think our friendship at the beginning, when we first started getting to know each other, so much of what we were talking about was music. And when we were first getting to know each other, especially was this kind of really wonderful kind of golden period of a lot of kind of 60s and 70s kind of minimal and experimental recordings finally being reissued, these things that, you could only have read about before or, purchased for, many hundreds of dollars or things like this. And so a lot of this music was kind of coming back to the fore. And so, a lot of our friendship in the early days was about talking about these records and loving these records and realizing if they had this really physical kind of visceral effect on us. And so what would it mean to try to make a fiction film that gave us hopefully some of these similar feelings? So that's kind of how the sound kind of came to the fore, so that it isn't the dominant model, which is just an emphasis on dialogue recording, such that any other sound that isn't the recording of dialogue is sort of a necessary evil or even just a total afterthought. It's similar to this idea that Maurice Maeterlinck talked about, this idea that, why is it that, the hero avenging his honor or so on needs to be in the foreground, and the infinite sound of the cosmos needs to either be completely muted or not particularly thought about. Why can't we bring these all to the fore and move the hero to the background and hear this whole world come alive? And here he was talking about these things in, the 1890s, and somehow still it's, 130 years later, it's jarring for people when someone actually goes ahead and does it.
No, for sure.
And so I think those are kind of things that interest us. At the end of the day, we love listening. We love listening. And so why wouldn't it be more a part of a film?
No, for sure.
Yeah. I think there's a quote that, Straub made a lovely quote kind of, I think in 2016, which would have been after we had filmed, but he says, most American films are humanist, whereas we are trying to make films where the men in the frame are no more important than a small stone, rock, or blade of grass, a breath of wind, a cicada, or a bird that passes. And I think in many ways, with the sound and with Anders' pictures, I think this is a lot of what there's a lot of the spirit of kind of the way that we're working. Yeah.
Did you want to say something, Anders? It seemed like you were.
No, I was just saying we love walking as well.
No, so you can expand on that. It sounds like a small comment, but it's really important.
Yeah, that's what we've always done. We've been walking and looking and listening and then recording all those things and think about. We've done a lot of walks together and then like really long walks, and then sometimes talking about these things like over 20 years time, and we always seem to get interested in the same things somehow.
No, it's amazing to be able to share that. That's and I think, I mean, there is something, I mean, I think the idea of walking being a key thing doesn't surprise me in seeing the film, because the film, I mean, in a very not one-to-one way, the film does kind of approximate that. Or I feel, I mean, I've never even been to Japan, but I mean, I feel like through seeing that film, there is a kind of a sense of being moved through a space in a kind of perambulatory, meandering kind of way over a period of time. And that's, I mean, it's amazing when, I think when cinema can kind of do that, when it is this kind of idea of a kind of an experience or a movement through space, or a kind of a grasping of a space that one has actually never seen or has never been in.
Yeah. I mean, I think in kind of musical notation, since we're talking about sound and music, it is this somehow imperfectly like this idea of the andante kind of, as far as musical tempo goes, you know, the idea of playing at a walking pace.
Sure.
And I think that's kind of essentially what we aspire to with the film, is that it's a film that proceeds at this kind of andante. Yeah.
No, I would agree. I guess we need to begin to be wrapping up, because we've been talking a long time, and I'm sure we could continue to keep talking. And maybe we will also do something in Madrid, which would be amazing. But I mean, a last kind of maybe relatively banal question. I mean, you've both talked about, you know, this sort of the amount of time, you know, the film was first, it was 2010, I think, when the film was first kind of, it was decided that the film would be made, or the direction of the film was talked about. Obviously, it was shot over a long period of time. It was edited over a long period of time. I was kind of wondering, how does one then at some point, I mean, you're still on the festival tour of the film, but at one point, how does one get that project out of one's system, or how does one recover from it, or how does one also move on from it when it has taken up obviously such a huge amount of time? And, you know, there's still a book to emerge, which is obviously linked to the film. I mean, I would be interested to know how there's kind of that process of separation from such a huge work on some level.
I'll have to tell you at some point in the future, because that hasn't happened yet.
We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know.
We don't know. I mean, you know, we got to premiere the film at Berlin, which was wonderful, and then about a week later, the whole world shut down, and so it's sort of, yeah. I mean, I don't say this in a piteous way. I'm not asking for sympathy, but we've sort of been denied the process. We've been denied the process of that sort of weaning off of this project by virtue of, not having had the chance to do a proper festival tour yet, or go out and really interact with audiences terribly much. We've been able to go to 2 other festivals, and that's it. And so I think that, I mean, this is a question that we'll probably need a couple years to answer.
Okay, then I will be happy to get back to you and find out what that question is further down the line. No, I mean, then it makes me all the happier, you know, that we are showing the film in an auditorium in Madrid in a few weeks. I mean, that is an amazing, because I think it is, I mean, obviously based on its duration, it's a film that maybe is going to be more difficult to see than like a conventional 90-minute film. And I think it's, I mean, both for the audiences that we have in Madrid, and I think for the 2 of you, it's amazing that in this crazy, horrible year of whatever, we could talk for hours about that too, that actually still, by some freak coincidence, it's still actually possible. So I look forward very much to that. And so thank you very, very much for taking this time. And it's been a super interesting discussion. And like I said, I still have like many more questions, but maybe we can talk about them further down the line in Madrid. So
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.